Hello everyone, in this video we're going to talk about midterm review part 5, the cycles. So let's start with the cycles. The first one is called the water cycle. It's pretty simple. We drew this in class, but let's take a look at this as a review. So we can start really anywhere as a cycle. Well, right here there's precipitation, water coming down from the sky in all shapes and forms. Hoping for some snow next week. We have runoff of water going down a surface because of gravity. And then we have not only water can run off a surface, it can also go into the surface. So when water is absorbed in the soil, this is also called percolation. When runoff happens, water can eventually flow into a body of water, ocean, lake, whatever, rivers. And then the underground water can also become the underground aquifers and eventually flow back into the bodies of water as well. And then we have water evaporating from all the surfaces. Anytime you have water, they evaporate, right? Which the evaporated water could eventually turn into precipitation. And then lastly, we have something called transpiration, where water evaporates from the leaves, right? It's the same thing as regular evaporation, except this is done by plants, right? Water going against gravity in the plant due to cohesion and adhesion, which allows the water, The water is going up the plant due to cohesion and adhesion, and then eventually can evaporate from the leaves, which actually helps getting the water, keeps on going upward. All right, so let's take a look at the questions for the water cycle. We did number 1 already. What is transpiration? Water evaporating from the leaves. How are transpiration and evaporation similar? They're both water turning from liquid water into gas form. How are transpiration and evaporation different from each other, and what kind of process is it? They're different because evaporation could be a biological process or a physical process, but it's usually a physical process, meaning that you're simply changing the states of the water. Transpiration, however, is what we call a biological process because a living organism is allowing this evaporation to happen. This water is going through a living organism before it evaporates. Which part of the water cycle is a biological process? Transpiration. Do water molecules always follow the same steps through the water cycle? The answer is no. Anytime you have a cycle, well, it's not exactly a full circle. It goes in all the directions, right? Now we're moving on to the carbon cycle. All right, the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is really important because every single living thing needs carbon, right? And all the macromolecules, your lipid, carbohydrate, proteins, and nucleic acid, they all need carbon. So it's really important for us to have plenty of carbon. And where do you get your carbons? You can, again, start anywhere, but we're going to start right here with the atmospheric carbon dioxide coming into the plant. But also, though, the one that's missing over here is that when plants, fungi or bacteria to go through cell respiration, they also will breathe out carbon dioxide. So we're not talking about any fungi or bacteria over here. There are certain photosynthetic fungi and bacteria that can do cellular respiration and photosynthesis at the same time. So those will allow photosynthesis to make carbohydrates using carbon dioxide, as we've learned before. And then when they breathe out carbon dioxide as well. And then moving down the food chain, we have any kind of animal that eats plants or other animals that eat animals down the food chain. So you're passing on carbons just by eating food and then passing on waste and all that. And at the same time, all living organisms go through cell respiration, as we've learned. So this animal right here will also breathe out carbon dioxide, which allows carbon dioxide to go back into the atmosphere. And then the next one is when any organism passes away, bacteria and other types of decomposers will come in and break down your entire body, basically. And during that process, these decomposers break down your dead body will breathe out carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere as well, right? During decomposing all living things, no matter what you're doing. Even the decomposers, when they're breaking down a dead body, Sounds so strange. When they're breaking down a dead organism and using that as the food for bacteria, they would also breathe out carbon dioxide. The next one is, given the right conditions, deceased organisms can become fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas. And then these carbons get stored underground. However, we're really good at burning fossil fuels, burning coal, oil, natural gas, and when we burn the fossil fuels, we're releasing the carbons again, and we're releasing the carbons in the form of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Okay, so this is a whole cycle on land, but there's also something going on in the ocean because there's a lot of living organisms in the ocean. So what we have over here is that when carbon dioxide can dissolve in water, and when carbon dioxide dissolve in water, they can combine with calcium and form this calcium carbonate, which is a solid. And this makes up a lot of the cytoskeletons, the outside skeletons of organisms living in the ocean, the ones that have skeletons. So crabs, for example, they have the shell of the crab, which contains carbon. Obviously, the entire body of crab contains carbon as well. And when a marine organism such as a crab dies, it can get dissolved in the water, and then eventually some of that carbon will become a part of the limestone. And then the limestone can dissolve and release more carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide can go back into the atmosphere as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Now let's take a look at the questions. How is plant involved in the carbon cycle? They absorb carbon dioxide using photosynthesis, and they release carbon dioxide using cellular respiration, because again, plants are not just doing photosynthesis for us. They're not doing it for us at all. They're doing photosynthesis to make food for itself, and so that it can go through cellular respiration and use it again. Where do animals obtain carbon? They obtain it from their food, right? If you're an herbivore, you obtain your carbon from a plant. If you're other types of animals, you obtain your food from whatever you eat, right? What are the ways that carbon can be stored away from the atmosphere? There are several ways. There's photosynthesis that allows carbon dioxide to come down from the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide can go get dissolved in the water. That's one way to remove carbon from the atmosphere. That's pretty much it. Oh, yeah, that's it. And then, hold on, I'm blanking. Which question are we on? Oh, we're on 63D. 63D, how are decomposers involved in the carbon cycle? The decomposers break down, well, depending on what kind of decomposer you're talking about. They're decomposers, well, actually, we're talking about decomposers. Decomposers break down dead animals and plants and all other living organisms, and then release carbon dioxide while it's breaking down the material. Why is the carbon cycle essential for sustaining life on Earth? Because all living organisms need carbon, so you need to get your carbon somewhere. I think that explains it enough. How is human activity affecting the carbon cycle? Human activities. There's plenty of carbon that's stored away, right? And then there's kind of this equilibrium between how much carbon is being released into the atmosphere and how much carbon dioxide is being stored away. However, there's all these carbon sources that have been underground for a really long time, and they need to stay underground in order to keep the balance, or at least slowly release itself out into the atmosphere again. But when we're burning fossil fuels, we're releasing a ton of carbon into the atmosphere a lot faster than the nature can handle, really. So then we're building up a lot of greenhouse gases. That's it for the carbon cycle. Let's talk about the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen cycle is right here. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle is really important, and you need to know why that is. Nitrogen is used in the building of nucleic acid and protein. So all nucleic acid and protein needs nitrogen, okay? So nucleic acid is your DNA, RNA. Clearly, that's very important for you. That's what makes you you. Proteins are very important because that also makes you you. Everything in your body needs protein, right? Come to AP Bio, and we'll talk more about proteins. So nitrogen, there's several forms of nitrogen. It's really important for you to understand that there's a gas form of nitrogen that is very difficult for living organisms to use. So the nitrogen N2 that's all over the atmosphere, it makes up the majority of the air that you breathe. But really, with all that nitrogen, you're breathing it in, you breathe it right out because your body cannot absorb the nitrogen gas. So what happens? What do? We have something called atmospheric nitrogen fixation that turns N2 into NO3, turns nitrogen gas into nitrate. This becomes a more usable form of nitrogen that certain organisms can use directly. At a volcano, for example, because there's a lot of energy there being released there as well, we can turn nitrogen into usable forms of nitrogen as well. So all you have to know is that N2 is non-usable, and all the other forms, whether it's ammonia or nitrate or nitrite, you really don't have to remember the names, but if you do see these names, know that they're usable forms of nitrogen, some sort of usable form, okay? And then we have something called a legume plant versus a non-legume plant. Beautiful names. So the legume plants are the ones that have bacteria living on its roots. They have this symbiotic relationship where the bacteria, well, it's actually a mutualistic relationship where the bacteria is benefiting the legume plant, and the legume plant also gives the bacteria a place to live. So this legume plant, what's so fantastic about it? These bacteria that live on the roots of these legume plant are called nitrogen fixing bacteria, and it goes through this process called nitrogen fixation. What's so wonderful about this bacteria? This bacteria takes atmospheric nitrogen N2, the unusable form, and turn it into NH4 plus, ammonia, which is a usable form for the legume plant specifically, right? This is wonderful because now we're bringing the nitrogen down to the bacteria and then giving it to plants, which is, a lot of us eat plants. It's just great when plants can figure out what it's doing with its life. And then we also have something called non-legume plants. So these don't have bacteria living directly on its roots, but plants still need to get their nitrogen somewhere, right? Clearly, you can get some nitrogen from the soil if it's already there. But also, it's wonderful to have something called nitrifying bacteria that take ammonia and take it one step further and turn it into nitrate and nitrite, so that it becomes even more usable, because legume plants can take ammonia in and use it, but non-legume plant cannot do it. So these nitrification bacteria, the nitrifying bacteria that go through the process called nitrification, they just live in the soil, living its life. But this is wonderful for all of us because they're able to take nitrogen one step further, making it even more usable so that the non-legume plants can use it. Right? And that now this non-legume plant and the legume plant are both growing fantastic. What's next? We as animals, we're going to eat these plants, and then we eat each other and we go down the food chain. We're passing on this nitrogen so that everybody gets to live. And then we also would release waste, right? Release urine and waste, and eventually we die. And what happens next? Here comes the decomposers again. Decomposers are so wonderful because without them, the entire world would just look like a battleground. There would be dead bodies everywhere. Not great, but decomposers kind of recycles everything. It breaks down the dead material or the waste or the urine, and then goes through a process called denitrification. And there's a specific type of bacteria called denitrifying bacteria. What do those do? They take the more complex forms of nitrogen, the ammonia, nitrate, and nitrite, and process it back into nitrogen so that the nitrogen gas can be released back into the atmosphere. So we have a full cycle of nitrogen being taken down in multiple ways, right? Becoming fixed over here, becoming fixed over here, becoming fixed over here, nitrification over here, right? We're taking the nitrogen and making it usable, and then eventually it gets released back into the atmosphere again. Wonderful cycle. So here we have the nitrogen cycle. Let's take a look at the questions. We already did the first one. Where can you find a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere? Can plants and animals use nitrogen directly from the atmosphere? The answer is no. Okay. How does nitrogen fixation and nitrification work? Nitrogen fixation turns N2 nitrogen gas into ammonia. Nitrification turns ammonia into nitrate and nitrite, making it even more usable. How does denitrification work? So really you can look at these questions and see if you can answer yourself before I keep on going, but you do you. Whatever works for you. Well, hopefully you know what works the best for you. Otherwise, just listen to me, okay? How does denitrification work? It takes ammonia, nitrate, nitrite, and break down, make it into nitrogen gas again. It's important because it releases nitrogen back into the atmosphere. The reason why nitrogen fixation and nitrification is important is because it turns nitrogen into usable forms so that animals can use it, and plants, and everything else living. How is lightning and volcano involved in the nitrogen cycle? They turn nitrogen into a usable form. Where do animals obtain nitrogen from? Plants or other animals or everything else that they eat? What type of macromolecules require nitrogen? Those are the nucleic acid and proteins. Nitrogen fixation is carried out primarily by what kind of organism? Those are our friendly neighborhood bacteria. Can animals consume nitrogen directly from the air? No. Where can they obtain nitrogen? From their food. How do humans affect the nitrogen cycle? We're a part of the nitrogen cycle. We are a part of the food chain. Wait, am I missing something? I'm missing something. My goodness. Nitrogen cycle. Yes. Humans affect the nitrogen cycle because we use a lot of fertilizers. And when we use fertilizers, we're using fertilizer because nitrogen is needed for plants to grow, right? So we're using fertilizers to help plants grow so that plants have enough nutrients. When we use too much nitrogen, eventually those nitrogen in the fertilizer will go through, will run off. When it rains, the fertilizer can run off into the oceans and lakes and ponds and rivers. And what's wrong with that? We have a lot of algae living in these bodies of water as well. And then these water plants and protist water organisms, photosynthetic organisms, start to use these nitrogen and really growing, right? They didn't need this. It came out of nowhere. There's this feast of nitrogen. Let's start growing. This is wonderful. This is wonderful at first, but then eventually the algae die. And when the algae die, the decomposers will decompose, and then they're going to release a lot of carbon dioxide and nitrogen back into the atmosphere. So how do we affect the nitrogen cycle? We use too much nitrogen is what happens here. The next one, biological process convert nitrogen gas to ammonia. That is our nitrogen fixation. Why do living things need nitrogen? Because we need it in proteins and nucleic acid. What happens if nitrogen cycle stops? Everybody dies. Now we're on to the phosphorus cycle. There's so many cycles. Man, oh man. Okay. All right, here we go. Phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus cycle is important because our DNA and RNA needs, or nucleic acid, needs phosphorus. This also includes ATP. Yes, ATP, right? ATP. The P over there is phosphorus, guys. Phosphorus is very important for us. How do we get our phosphorus? We have some undersea sedimentary rocks shift up during tectonic plate movement. So you have these underground plates, right? They move, and these phosphorus get released from the underground into the ocean. Once the phosphorus gets into the ocean, they can be absorbed. They can come on land somehow, and they get absorbed by the soils and rocks, and they become a part of the soil and rocks. And then we have the erosion of the soil and the rock, and the phosphorus flow into water, of all the bodies of water, right? And then once it's in the water, it can be absorbed into the soil again, and then plants can absorb these phosphorus. This is wonderful. And then plants can use this phosphorus to build its own nucleic acid. What happens next? If you're an animal, you need to eat some plants. We're always eating plants. This is wonderful. Or you can eat other animals down the food chain, and you're obtaining phosphorus through your diet. And then eventually, again, animals die, plants die, all living things eventually die, and decomposers come in again to break down the organic material and release the phosphorus back into the soil and into the bodies of water. Here's a full cycle of your phosphorus cycle. Let's take a look at the questions. What type of macromolecule requires phosphorus? Nucleic acid. How do plants obtain phosphorus? From soil and water. Or fertilizers that we put in the ground. How do animals obtain phosphorus? Through the diet. How are decomposers involved in the phosphorus cycle? They break down the phosphorus. They break down the dead organisms and then release the phosphorus into the water and soil again. Limiting nutrient. Okay, this is pretty important. I'm going to type down a few things for you. Limiting nutrient is something that limit the growth of an organism. Okay, so we're limiting the growth of an organism. Those are called limiting nutrient. If you have plenty of water, you would not call that a limiting nutrient. If you don't have enough iodine in your diet, that becomes the limiting nutrient. Okay, why do we add limiting nutrient during farming? So that we can grow more crops, right? If we have this farmland, we keep on using it and using it, eventually the nutrients are going to run out from the soil. But we're trying to make more crops. What do? We add some fertilizers. But here's the problem. We never add just enough fertilizer. You really don't know how much you're adding. So people add too much fertilizer into the farmland, and here's what happens next. So we go fertilizer, and then we have runoff of the fertilizer into the ocean, lake, and rivers, ... And then we have the overgrown of algae because there's too much nutrient, right? But this is fun at first because algae goes through photosynthesis and they're actually using carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen. But then when you have so much algae don't get to live all that long. Algae die, and then decomposers break down dead algae, and then eventually use up oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide in the water. So what's the problem with that? Fish and everything else in the water need oxygen. So now we have something called, this is so inefficient. There's something called a dead zone. This is a dead zone because there's no more oxygen, so everything dies, right? The fish can't live when there's no oxygen in the water. Fish still breathe oxygen. They're just really good at breathing oxygen that's already in the water, okay? So what is an algae bloom? When there's too much algae growing, that's called algae bloom. This step right here, overgrown of algae, is called algae bloom. What causes it? Overuse of fertilizer, the runoff of fertilizer. What are the effects? Everything dies. The formation of dead zones, and everything dies in the ocean. Not everything dies in the ocean specifically. The ocean is big, but you get what I'm saying. We can create zones, dead zones, where nothing can grow, okay? Moving on finally to lecture 2.6. This is not going to last as long. I promise, we're almost there. How are climate and weather different? You already know. Climates is the overall average precipitation and temperature and all that. Weather is the day-to-day temperature and precipitation. What are the two important abiotic factors when we describe climate? Temperature and precipitation. What effects do greenhouse gas have on the amount of heat trapped in the atmosphere? The more greenhouse gas you have, the more heat is trapped. What would happen if there's a dramatic decrease in greenhouse gases? The Earth gets way too cold for anyone to live on. What is a population? A population is same species living in the same area. So if we're talking about horses of a certain type, we're only talking about horses. If we're talking about sea otters, my favorite animal, we're only talking about sea otters. No. My favorite animal is river otters. Let me correct myself. That is not on the test. Can individuals in a population interbreed and interact? Clearly, obviously. Otherwise, you wouldn't call it a population, right? There are three ways that we can define the population. Population size, density, and dispersion. Population size, it's talking about how big your population is, right? Density is how many individuals you have within the population within a certain area. So you're defining how big the area is. in addition to how many individuals are in there, right? If you're crowding 50 people in this tiny room, the density is pretty high. If Miss Vi is the only person here, Miss Vi and Rabbit, who's not here, then the density is very low. Miss Vi and a rabbit are not a population, though. We're not the same species, just to be clear. Population dispersion is how spread out the population is. There are factors that affect the population size. Okay, let's see. We have birth, death, immigration. Why am I talking like this? So we have birth and immigration that increases the population size. We have death and emigration that decreases the population size, right? So then you can have a combination of all different kinds of factors. If you have a lot of birth and not a lot of death, population is going to increase. If you have a lot of birth and some immigration, but also a lot of emigration, then who really knows? You have to read the question. How do you define density of a population? We already defined that. A certain number of individuals of a population per area. What techniques do we use to estimate a population size? Because sometimes you just have way too many people. For example, it'll take forever to count everybody on Earth. We mark and recapture. We don't actually mark and recapture people. Anyway, you can mark and recapture other organisms and try to estimate how many individuals are within a population. Dispersion is how spread out everything is. We have 3 types of dispersion right here. Whoa, this is the last one. We have clumped dispersion, where you have, little clumps of individuals within the population just all clumped together. We have uniform dispersion, where everybody is evenly spread out. And then we have random dispersion, where it's random, right? There is no pattern whatsoever. This is it. Have a wonderful weekend, guys.